Hello, and welcome to the LinkedIn Live series. My name is Yuji Winet, and I'm an assistant professor of marketing here at Fuqua. I've been studying consumer psychology for just about a decade now, and for most of that time, I've been studying what's known as the exploration-exploitation trade-off, which is this idea that consumers are constantly facing this dilemma between trying new things and going with old favorites, whether they're choosing between what to buy, where to eat, what to wear, who to date. These are all decisions where people have to make some sort of trade-off between novelty and familiarity. So in this talk, I'm going to discuss some research with my colleague at the University of Chicago, where we unpack a more nuanced version of this dilemma. And we're going to be looking at it within experiences to think about how consumers want novelty and familiarity to be traded off as experiences unfold over time. What kind of patterns do they like? So specifically, I'm going to talk about one pattern that works especially well when it's done right, and that is what is colloquially known as the callback. So now I will go ahead and share my slides. Throughout the talk, feel free to drop any questions or comments that you'd like me to address into the chat. There will be 10 minutes at the end for a Q&A session, and I will go ahead and address those at that point. Feel free to drop in any questions or comments as I go, or save them for the end. So as consumers go about their day, they have lots of different types of experiences. Some of them are designed by companies and creatives so that consumers will consume them. And the hope is that consumers will value them and enjoy them, and also that they'll pay for them and rate them highly and tell their friends and family about them. But how exactly do you design experiences that really resonate with consumers? As you already know, it's a very complicated question. But one strategy that I'll share with you today is one that taps into the fundamental psychology of novelty and familiarity and also meaning. So we'll talk about how if you combine these in a particular way, you can actually design better experiences for your consumers. So I want to start with an example of a TV commercial from the 90s. Some of you might remember this one. A group of toy rabbits is running on some generic battery, and they all run out of power. Then the Energizer Bunny, this guy here, barges in, whirling around. He's bursting with energy because he's powered by an Energizer battery. And so he disrupts the other rabbits, and he's so full of energy, in fact, that he leaves the studio where the commercial itself is being filmed. Next, another ad comes on. This one is for Nasatine sinus relief nasal spray. So a man is suffering from springtime allergies. He complains of sinus congestion, and a doctor comes on and he starts to explain the medical benefits of Nasatine sinus relief nasal spray. Then suddenly the Energizer Bunny comes barging back in, disrupting the doctor and this supposed Nasatine ad, revealing that this is actually, in fact, a continuation of the earlier ad from Energizer. So in under 30 seconds, this ad accomplishes something very powerful in terms of experiential design. It's a masterclass in what we're calling the callback structure. So it introduces something, seemingly moves on from it, and then brings it back in a way that changes the way that you understand it. So it takes something familiar and then adds a new interpretation to it. So when Energizer aired this commercial, there were actually dozens of different examples, iterations of this kind of ad where the Energizer Bunny would come in and interrupt some fake commercial for some fake brand, for some fake product. And they were all using this callback structure. And I will say that I think it's no coincidence that this callback-based ad campaign ended up being one of the most famous ad campaigns in television history. So many of you have probably heard the term callback before. It's a common idea among entertainers like comedians and writers and filmmakers. And there's this general familiarity with this vague idea that if you reference something from earlier in your comedy set or your novel or your film in a way that the audience isn't expecting, that you can elicit some kind of response from them, whether it's a laugh or some feeling of dramatic resonance or something along those lines. But even though it's used regularly, that doesn't mean we understand how it works or even what it really is, and certainly not what the underlying psychology of it is. And so that all of that is to say that we don't have a systematic way of using it as a technique to improve experiences. And so that's where this research comes in. So we aim to use science to try to unpack how the callback structure works, and we're doing that so that you can use it to actually make your consumers' experiences better. So, what exactly is a callback? Formally, a callback is a way of designing or organizing an experience to have familiar earlier moments be reintroduced with new meaning. So with the Energizer ad, you're introduced to the Energizer Bunny, then we seemingly move on from it, then we bring back this now familiar Energizer Bunny and reveal it to be more than what we thought it was originally. It's more than just this energetic toy. It ends up being this boundary-breaking entity that can invade and take over other brands' commercials. And so note how this is different from just pure repetition or even just referencing or mentioning something. So this is not the same thing as taking that first half of the ad and playing it twice. And it's also not the same thing as simply saying, hey, do you remember that Energizer Bunny? Instead, what it does is it takes that Energizer Bunny and it changes how you understand it. Now, there are a number of qualities of a prototypical callback. These are qualities that you tend to find in callbacks in the wild, but that aren't strictly necessary. So one is that it tends to happen within a single experience. So you often find callbacks within a given movie, and it's less common to see them across different movies. They also happen a lot of times at the ends of experiences, often at the very, very end of experiences as a way to sort of close them out. And they often happen intentionally because whoever designed the experience, like an author, built them into the experience itself. All right, now why might callbacks improve experiences? It's because they provide both a sense of closure and a sense of what we're calling experiential guidance. So during experiences, especially ones where consumers tend not to have a whole lot of agency, so like watching movies or sitting on a roller coaster, consumers might look for signals that whoever designed their experience really understands them. They're looking for a good experiential tour guide. So they want to feel that whoever's responsible for their experience understands their thoughts and feelings as they go through the experience, and that they use that understanding to then structure the experience in a way that guides them through in the most rewarding way possible. So it requires a kind of intimate understanding of the consumer's thoughts and feelings. And so in a way, it allows the designer of the experience to communicate to them, I understand you, you can trust me, relax and enjoy. So we know that callbacks do get used in the wild, but do people actually like them? So to answer this, we went to what is probably the birthplace of the term callback. We went to the context of stand-up comedy. We wanted to know if callback jokes outperformed all the other kinds of jokes. And so we gathered the top 20 most popular stand-up comedy specials on Netflix. And we gathered data about every single joke within them. And so these were famous comedians like Dave Chappelle and Ali Wong and Bill Burr and so on. And so we ended up recording data on 5,513 jokes, all of the jokes in all of those specials. And we recorded a few things. One was how long the audience laughed at each joke. One was whether or not they applauded or cheered for each joke. And one was whether or not the joke itself was a callback or not. And so what we find is that individual callbacks do perform well. Here's a graph of all 5,000 jokes. On the x-axis is how far into the special it is. So on the left side, you have the beginning of the special, and on the right side, you have the end of the special. And then on the y-axis, you have how long the audience laughed at any given joke in seconds. So all the gray dots are all the non-callback jokes. So this is every other type of joke that a comedian could possibly have in their tool belt and chose to use. Then all the red dots are the callback jokes. And as you can see, the callback jokes got bigger laughs, got more laugh time than the non-callback jokes. So actually, people laughed more than twice as long at the callback jokes than the non-callback jokes. It's about 8 seconds for callbacks, about 3 seconds for non-callbacks. So we also found a few other sort of interesting patterns worth taking forward. One is that callbacks tend to happen later in the special, later in the experience. And as they got later in the special, they also became funnier and funnier. We also find that the larger the gap was between a callback and the thing that it's referencing, the funnier it was as well. So this tells us that callbacks might be pretty powerful. But also there's something interesting here, which is that there are remarkably few callbacks being used. Out of 5,000 jokes, only 25 were actually callbacks. And that's a little bit astonishing considering how clearly powerful they seem to be. So if they're being underutilized in stand-up comedy of all places, then maybe they're being underutilized in other contexts too. So next, we wanted to check if callbacks were powerful enough to change how people evaluated entire experiences as a whole. So we gathered data on the top 1,000 movies on IMDb. And we tried to figure out if movies that used callbacks more tended to get higher star ratings and earn more at the box office. So the next step was, how do you figure out how much a movie uses callbacks or not? This ended up not being viable in terms of time and cost to use human participants to figure this out. And so instead, we gave ChatGPT our definition of callbacks, and we had it create a callback score for every movie. Now, there's a question of, is it doing a good job? And so we validated ChatGPT's answers by taking samples of those ratings that it gave, along with explanations that we had to give. And we showed those to actual human participants and got their levels of agreement or disagreement with ChatGPT's answers. And we found that ChatGPT was doing a surprisingly good job. So here's an example of one of the ratings and explanations for the Shawshank Redemption. So the scale was callback scores were from 1 to 7. Shawshank Redemption got a 6 out of 7. And if you look through here, you'll see very specific examples of callbacks that are used that are both specific and correct. And so this is just to give you a sense. We also validated ChatGPT and our analysis by having ChatGPT give scores for other qualities of movies that we might care about. So these were things like, how is the cinematography? How is the acting? And we used those in our analysis to make sure we were just looking at callbacks. And so what we find is that experiences that used callbacks more performed better. So here's a chart with a callback score on the x-axis from 1 to 7, as I mentioned. And then on the y-axis, you have the IMDb rating. And so movies, sorry, you should see tiny little dots in there. Those are the 1,000 movies, and overlaid on that are some of the titles for reference. And so movies that used callbacks more tended to have higher star ratings, and they also tended to earn more money. So for every 1 extra point on the callback score, a movie earned $77 million more. So this tells us that callbacks might make entire experiences better, but this is correlational, so we need to establish causation. So we need to make sure that callbacks themselves add value instead of something we might have picked up by accident. So we looked at whether callbacks can make brands more memorable. We had 748 participants watch 17 TV commercials, all for these different brands, and we gave them a surprise memory test right after the TV commercials, and then again 2 weeks later. And the test was we asked them to name as many of the brands that they could remember from those TV commercials as they could. And we were interested in whether they named a particular brand. And this particular brand was chosen because that was the one that we manipulated their exposure to. So participants either saw a single instance of that brand's ad, a repeated instance of that brand's ad, so that ad shown twice, because we know that showing ads multiple times helps consumers remember the brands better, or we showed a callback ad, which was the brand's ad plus a callback ad. And so the brand that we used was actually Energizer. And so you have a frame of reference for what I'm talking about. So the single ad was just the first half of the Energizer ad. The repeated ad was the first half of the ad shown twice. And the callback ad was the same example that I used, the Energizer ad and the callback ad. And we actually mixed in a series of different Energizer ads from their campaign just to make sure it wasn't just about this particular one. And so we found that consumers remembered the brand better over time from callback ads. So on the left column of this chart, you'll see the immediate recall test. And then on the right side, you'll see the 2-week delay memory test. And on the y-axis is the percent of participants that named Energizer. So first, what you'll see is that the callback ad outperformed the single ad. And also the repeated ad outperformed the single ad. And there was no difference between the callback ad and the repeated ad. But 2 weeks later, the callback ad kept the brand in participants' memories. So they still remembered Energizer 2 weeks later quite well. Whereas if they saw the repeated ad, they almost completely forgot it to the point where it was no different from having seen the ad only once. So this tells us that the effect of repetition went away, but the effect of the callback structure did not. So it seems that callbacks caused people to remember the brand better over time. Now, how about other downstream marketing consequences, and also what explains this effect? In this study, we had 500 participants read a joke with either a larger or a smaller callback. And here we used a canonical street joke known as the brick joke. It's both very silly and kind of profound in what it represents, because there's nothing about it that is funny, but it does have one thing going for it, which is that it contains a callback. Even the callback is not funny, but the fact that there is a callback gives this joke some kind of value, as you'll see. So participants read this joke that basically goes nowhere, and it ends with a brick being thrown in the air and not coming back down. Then they read another joke about people arguing on a plane. There's parrots and cigars involved, and it ends with a parrot hitting the windshield of the plane with a brick from the first joke in its mouth. So you'll notice this has the same structure as the Energizer ad. So this is the major callback condition. In the minor callback condition, we change the callback so that it only references something that happened moments earlier and only slightly changes its significance. In this case, it's about what happens to a cigar that somehow gets thrown out of the window. Again, there's nothing funny about this, but what is significant is that the brick callback is a bigger callback because it forces you to update your whole understanding of the first joke, and that's just not the case with the smaller callback. Now, we had participants report a few measurements of interest. They gave it a star rating, reported their emotions about it, how much they were willing to pay for how much they thought this was worth, and their likelihood of sharing it with friends and family. And we also asked about experiential guidance, this sense that people care about the experience architect understanding their thoughts and feelings as they go through the experience and using that understanding to structure the experience to be as enjoyable as possible. And so what we find is that bigger callbacks make experiences better, and it's because consumers feel guided through the experience. And so a quick summary of this is that all the black bars are the bigger callback and all the gray bars are the smaller callback. So across the board, people preferred the bigger callback. It was more enjoyable, more meaningful, more rewarding. People gave it a higher star rating. People thought it was worth more to have that experience, and people were more likely to share it with friends and family. And that this seemed to be explained by a sense of experiential guidance. So these are the individual measures of experiential guidance, but the takeaway is that consumers felt like in the major callback condition that they were better understood, their thoughts and feelings were understood by the experiential guide, and that they had structured the experience to be as rewarding as possible for them. As a side benefit, feeling guided through the experience not only explains all the positive outcomes that I described earlier, but also it makes the consumer feel more positively toward the experience architect, whoever designed the experience. So in sum, callbacks are a powerful tool for designing consumer experiences. The callback structure itself is a way of organizing an experience to bring back a familiar element with a new way of understanding it. They improve consumer experiences by making them more memorable, more enjoyable, more meaningful, more rewarding, and also downstream marketing outcomes like higher star ratings, making things seem like they're worth more money, and increasing sharing by word of mouth. And again, this is driven by the sense of experiential guidance, that consumers feel understood and guided through the experience. Okay. All right, that's what I have for you here. I'm going to close my slides and see if there are any questions. A question I often get when I present this project is about what kinds of future directions may lie ahead for understanding this phenomenon. And I think a really fruitful one for marketers is understanding how consumer bases bond over callbacks. As fandoms sort of interact with each other, do they actually prefer or bond even more over content and advertisements and films and so on that uses callbacks? Does it, because we see the sort of pro-social benefits that come from how consumers feel about the experience architect, there might also be bleed over into how consumers feel with regard to each other as well. We have a question here. Okay, please can you share the Energizer callback video again? I missed it and can't find it on YouTube. Oh, oops. Let's see. I won't be able to do that on the fly here, unfortunately, but I will certainly make sure that my team posts the video right afterwards. And so you'll see not only the callback ad that I described, but you'll also see maybe 20 or 50 other Energizer ads that use the same structure as well. All right. Okay, so in your experiment, what does it mean that you showed participants the callback ad? Was it a second ad with a callback from a previous ad? Okay, so that's something I should clarify so that we all understand here. The callback ad is basically a follow up to the original ad. The original ad is a standalone piece that introduces this Energizer bunny. The callback ad is seemingly a different advertisement, but then surprisingly brings back the Energizer bunny from the original ad. So the key thing here is that it reintroduces something familiar and puts a twist on it. Okay, can callbacks have the same value today in the era of rapidly evolving trends and quick short form content? That's a great question. I think the reason that's such an important question is because of how fragmented people's content consumption is in the modern era. The reason that a callback works well, and thank you for asking this, this is an important point, is that uh, you tightly control the meaning of the experience in order to be able to change it later, right? And so that's why callbacks so often happen within experiences, within a single movie, because you can at least inform the consumer exactly of what it something means in order to be able to change it. But in a fragmented space, it can be harder to control what something means to your consumer in the first place. And so in short form content, the idea is you have to be able to quickly establish meaning for your consumer and then change it, which is hard to do without much time. And so that's one reason that the Energizer ad is so amazing, is because it manages to do that in 30 seconds when it's certainly easier to do such a thing in a long form novel or a movie. Okay, so another question here is how generalizable is the callback structure to other kinds of experiences, perhaps ones that are further out in the real world, as opposed to entertainment media type of experiences. And that gets into a distinction that I'll be following up on in future research about how some experiences are pre-constructed and some experiences are more participatory and some experiences are more indeterminate, right? So when we're talking about these experiences that don't have a lot of agency, movies and roller coasters and so on, the creator of the experience has to design the experience ahead of time in a way that's satisfying for the consumer. But for something where the consumer has more agency and they can sort of shape the experience to their liking, it's not as clear whether a callback can be injected smoothly and easily because they're participating in creating the meaning themselves. But I do think that there is a lot of opportunity here. So you can imagine that callbacks might be really effective in conversation. In fact, in your personal life, you can try it and you'll probably find that it's quite effective. And so you can think about how this might apply in customer service interactions, that a greater use of callbacks might actually help smooth over those kinds of interactions. There's also the indeterminacy aspect, which is that some experiences are pre-created. They are sort of a whole object that has a sort of settled structure, and then there are others where you actually don't know what's going to happen, like a sports game. And so it might be that in those contexts, callbacks are also especially powerful because in order to do a callback on the fly means that you really must be paying attention to your consumers. Let's see here. Okay. This was great. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to figure out how to implement this in my social enterprise, solar-powered school bags for underserved kids. That's fantastic. I will keep an eye out. I would love to hear more about how you end up implementing that. Okay, so we've reached time. This was a pleasure. Thank you all so much for joining me. Next month, please join us again for Professor Jack Sull's presentation on Wednesday, February 5th at 12:30 p.m. That will be a talk on how to take advantage of the wisdom of the crowds. And please follow Fuqua on LinkedIn to be alerted to more of these kinds of events in the future. Thank you so much.